So we said there are three parts to the Java security story. And the first thing is permissions. So a permission in Java is represented by a subclass of the permission class. Permissions are used both for requesting a permission, so I have to explicitly ask for a permission, and for granting the permission. In code, a library will request a permission, and the policy will grant the permission. And there's some examples of permissions here. So for example, there's a file permission, and this extends the base permission class, and the file permission gives us or disallows us access to the file system. So we'd use this to set up read and or write access to the file system. There's a socket permission, and we can use this to allow us to access sockets on specific ports. And there's also things like a property permission, and this extends a base class called basic permission, which many other classes do. And the property permission allows me access to basic properties within the Java runtime, and we'll see examples of this in a moment. There's also policy. Policy is represented by a pluggable class. So there's a default policy that comes with a framework, but you can replace that with your own policy implementation. This works with our class loader, so our secure class loader, and something called a code source. And this allows us to grant permissions when code is loaded. So this is the granting mechanism. The default implementation uses something called a policy file, which is a text file which can grant permissions to allow us to do specific things. And the default policy file looks like this. This at least is the start of the policy file. This tells us, for example, that the extensions directory in Java, these things have all permissions. Any code loaded from the extensions directory can do anything it wants within the framework. And then underneath that, we see specific permissions granted. So code loaded from anywhere can stop a thread, it can listen on a socket, and there are many other things that this can do. We're not listing everything here, this is quite a long file. And then finally there's enforcement. So enforcement is represented by something called the access controller. And the access controller and the security manager work hand in hand to provide enforcement. It's the job of the developer to require permissions. So typically inside a framework, inside the library, the developer will call to the access controller and say, is this code that's currently executing allowed to do this thing? Does it have the permission to access the file system? Does it have the permission to access a socket? So this is an opt-in model. So every library has to opt in to security. So it's the job of the library writer to call into the access controller and say, is this permission allowed? And in the next module, we'll see how each of these things plays together to allow or disallow access to specific things within Java.